There is a letter sitting in a federal minister's office in Ottawa that the Canadian government has never been more uncomfortable about. It was written by one of the world's largest automakers. It was addressed to the minister responsible for protecting Canadian jobs. And it contained a promise, specific, written, signed, that vehicles would be rolling off an assembly line in Brampton, Ontario by the end of June 2026. That deadline just passed. The line is still silent, the plant is still dark, and the 3,000 workers who were told that letter meant something are still waiting. What happened to that promise is the story of what is happening to Canada's auto industry right now. Not just in Brampton, not just with one company, but across every plant, every union hall, every supplier, every family in southwestern Ontario that built their life around the assumption that the cars they made here would keep being made here. That assumption is over. And the paper trail of how it ended, the government deals, the taxpayer commitments, the broken assurances, the confidential contracts, tells you everything Ottawa has been hoping you wouldn't put together in one place. So let's put it together. Stellantis is the company that used to be called Chrysler. If you are old enough to remember the Chrysler bailout, the K-car, the minivan that became the most Canadian vehicle ever built, you know this company. It has been assembling cars in Windsor since 1928. It has been building minivans in Windsor since 1983. It is woven into the fabric of southwestern Ontario in a way that goes beyond economics. It is identity. Windsor calls itself Canada's automotive capital. That identity belongs, more than anywhere else, to the plant on the edge of the Detroit River that makes the Chrysler Pacifica and the Dodge Charger. 4,500 people work there. Dozens of supplier companies depend on it. The city breathes in rhythm with its shifts. But Windsor is only half of the story. 40 minutes east, in Brampton, Stellantis has a second plant. The Brampton assembly plant built the Chrysler 300, the Dodge Charger, and the Dodge Challenger, muscle cars that had a particular kind of following among Canadians who understood what it meant to build something powerful from scratch. Production there wound down in December 2023, when those models ended their run. The plan, announced publicly and backed by an enormous amount of your money, was to retool the Brampton plant for the next generation, to bring it back bigger, cleaner, and ready to build the new electric Jeep Compass. That was the promise. Here is how much Ottawa paid to secure that promise. In 2022, the federal government signed a deal providing up to $529 million to retool the Brampton and Windsor plants for electric vehicle production. By the time everything started to unravel, the federal government had already paid out at least $222 million of that money. $222 million of your taxes, transferred to one of the world's largest automakers, based on a commitment to keep those plants running, those jobs in Canada, those workers employed. That is not a small number. That is more than most Canadians will earn in their entire working lives, paid out before a single new vehicle came off the line in Brampton. But the $529 million is not even the big number in this story. The big number is $15 billion. In the summer of 2023, Stellantis and its South Korean battery partner LG Energy Solution were building a new electric vehicle battery facility in Windsor, a joint venture called Nexstar Energy. Construction stalled because the United States government had just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which offered enormous incentives to companies that built EV batteries on American soil. Stellantis looked at what the Americans were offering and told Ottawa, "Match it, or we're moving." So Ottawa matched it. The federal government and the province of Ontario signed a production subsidy deal worth up to $15 billion, $10.5 billion federal, $5.5 billion provincial, to keep the Nexstar battery plant in Windsor. By November 2025, at least $530 million had already been paid out. That $15 billion deal included a condition. It was stated publicly by government officials at the time it was signed. The condition was that Stellantis would uphold its existing commitments in Canada, including a production mandate at its plant in Brampton. The battery money and the Brampton commitment were linked. That is what Ottawa said at the time. That is what the documents, when CBC Windsor eventually obtained them, appeared to confirm. On October 15, 2025, Stellantis held a press conference. The company announced what it called the single largest investment in its history, US $13 billion, to expand manufacturing in the United States. More jobs in Illinois, more jobs in Ohio, more jobs in Michigan and Indiana. A major revitalization of American auto production. It was, by every measure, a remarkable corporate investment. The problem was where the money came from. The production of the Jeep Compass, the very model that was supposed to bring the Brampton plant back to life, would not be coming to Brampton. It was going to Belvidere, Illinois. That move would create 3,300 new American jobs. It would deepen Stellantis' American manufacturing footprint at the precise moment it was supposed to be deepening its Canadian one. And it would leave the 3,000 workers in Brampton, who had already been waiting 2 years, waiting still. Unifor President Lana Payne did not choose careful language that evening. She said Canadian auto jobs were being sacrificed on the Trump altar. Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown called it a gut punch. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said Stellantis had a duty to live up to its promise to Brampton auto workers. Industry Minister Melanie Joly launched a formal dispute resolution process and threatened legal action. Prime Minister Mark Carney said the decision was a direct consequence of US tariffs and called it deeply concerning. All of that happened in the same 24 hours. The reaction from every level of Canadian government was unanimous outrage. And then nothing changed. Because here is the thing about outrage in Ottawa. It arrives loudly and it resolves slowly. And the people waiting in Brampton have now been waiting for almost 3 years. The plant closed in December 2023. The retooling was paused in February 2025. The Jeep Compass was formally moved to Illinois in October 2025. And through all of it, there were letters and promises and funding deals, and dispute resolution processes, and threats of legal action. But not one new car has been built in Brampton since the last Dodge Challenger rolled off the line on the last day of 2023. Let's go back to that letter, because it matters more than anything else in this story. In February 2025, after Stellantis first paused the Brampton retooling, then Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne made a public show of posting a letter from the company addressed to him. The letter contained a commitment. Vehicles would roll off the Brampton assembly line by the end of June 2026. Champagne posted it publicly because it was supposed to be reassuring. Stellantis had given the government its word in writing. June 2026 was the line. June 2026 just ended. The plant is still dark. There is a confidential 98-page contract between the federal government and Stellantis that CBC Windsor obtained through access to information. What that contract says is important. It bars Stellantis from closing the Brampton plant before 2035. That sounds like a strong protection. But the contract includes an exception. For circumstances beyond the company's reasonable control that make the plant commercially unviable. US tariffs on imported vehicles. A trade war that made cross-border manufacturing economically punishing. A policy environment that rewarded companies for building in America and penalized them for building in Canada. Stellantis did not manufacture those circumstances. But the result is that a clause designed to protect Canadian workers in exceptional circumstances is now the legal instrument the company is leaning on to justify walking away from a written commitment. Meanwhile, in Windsor, the main plant kept running, but not smoothly. The Windsor assembly plant was shut for 2 weeks beginning April 7, 2025, with 3,200 employees off the job, because the tariffs made it difficult to predict how many vehicles crossing into the United States could be sold profitably. Then it was shut for another week in May. Then in August, additional layoffs landed, when Stellantis postponed its electric Dodge Charger and reduced production volume. The third shift that was supposed to return in early 2026, bringing back up to 1,000 jobs, has been the one visible piece of good news in an otherwise relentless series of setbacks. By April 2026, Stellantis came forward with a new proposal for Brampton. The company said it was in talks to assemble electric vehicles from its Chinese partner, Zhejiang Leapmotor Technology, at the idle plant. The plan involved what the industry calls knockdown kits, vehicles largely built in China, with the parts shipped to Brampton for final assembly. Minimal local content, minimal local employment relative to a real manufacturing operation. The idea was that Canadians would be paid to bolt together Chinese cars in a factory that was subsidized with over $500 million Canadian dollars to build Canadian cars. Industry Minister Joly rejected it. Doug Ford rejected it. Unifor rejected it. Flavio Volpe, head of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, said the federal government needed to be clear that knockdown kits were imports, that you cannot count assembling Chinese parts in Ontario as Canadian manufacturing. The Brampton plant remains idle. As of June 2026, there is no confirmed product, no production date, no new allocation, and no resolution to the formal dispute between Ottawa and a company that has received over $15 billion in Canadian taxpayer commitments. Bring this back to the numbers, because the numbers are the thing that should not get lost in the political noise. The Canadian government has committed over $15 billion to Stellantis-related projects in Ontario, the retooling deal, the Next Star battery plant subsidies, the provincial contributions. Of that $15 billion in commitments, at least $750 million has already been paid out. In the same period, Stellantis announced it would invest $13 billion in the United States. The Brampton plant is idle. 3,000 workers are in limbo. A written promise to have vehicles rolling by June 2026 was not kept. And the most recent proposal from the company for what to do with the plant involved assembling Chinese parts because there was nothing else on offer. The canary in the coal mine moment in this story came from an unlikely source. In April 2025, when the Windsor plant first shut down for 2 weeks and suppliers across Ontario started bracing for impact, Flavio Volpe said something that turned out to be exactly right. The canary just died, he said. He was talking about the tariff shutdowns. But what he was actually describing was something larger, the moment when every assumption that had held together Canada's auto sector for a generation became an open question. The assumption that you could manufacture vehicles in Canada and sell them in America without penalty. The assumption that a written government deal protected Canadian workers from corporate decisions made in boardrooms in Amsterdam and Detroit. The assumption that a city that had built cars since 1928 would keep building them because it had always built them and because the government had paid, in good faith, enormous amounts of public money to make sure it would. Every one of those assumptions is now in dispute. And the workers in Brampton who are still waiting, most of whom have been laid off since the Dodge Charger line ended in December 2023, some of whom were told as recently as February 2025 that their plant would be running by the end of June 2026. They are not waiting for a government press conference. They are waiting for a car to build. And right now, no one can tell them when that is going to happen, or whether the car will be a Jeep or a Leapmotor or something assembled from parts made in a country that has nothing to do with the community that has been waiting, patiently and then less patiently, for 3 years. Canada did not lose its auto sector in one announcement. It lost it in a series of pauses and postponements and reassurances that didn't hold, and contracts with exceptions wide enough to drive a minivan through. The Brampton plant is the most visible symbol of that process right now. But it is not the only one. And the question that nobody in Ottawa has answered, not in a press release, not in a committee hearing, not in a dispute resolution process, is a simple one. When a company takes over $15 billion in Canadian taxpayer commitments, what exactly does Canada get in return? Because the answer, as of today, appears to be a dark plant in Brampton, a written promise past its deadline, and a negotiation that is still ongoing while the workers it's about wait at home. That is the deal that was made on your behalf. And the only people who have said so plainly, in public, without softening the language, have been the union members who called it what it is. Canadian jobs sacrificed on an altar that Canada didn't build, for a trade war Canada didn't start, at a cost that Canada is still counting.